One of the more mysterious members of the late English Renaissance is Andrew Marvell. Among the British literati, he's a curious figure. He was a son of an Anglican clergyman, educated at Cambridge, probably traveled and served as a tutor for young aristocrats throughout his 20s. He became a secretary to the poet John Milton, an assistant in Cromwell's government, in Milton's capacity as the secretary or minister for foreign tongues or whatever his title was. From there, he was elected to Parliament in 1659, just a year before the restoration of Charles II, a touchy place to be for somebody of the revolutionary government. But following the restoration, Marvell was able to work a little bit as an insider there. He was able to avoid punishment for his own activities, and he helped Milton, notably, a much more prominent figure. He helped Milton avoid explicit punishment and execution, possibly. And Marvell even came and wrote a prefatory poem to a edition of Paradise Lost. So he was doing all of this as a kind of liminal figure, an insider who was then suddenly kind of on the outside of revolutionary government, the revolutionary cause, but he became a handy ally within English government after the return of the king. And this subtlety, this ability to perhaps function anonymously, I think comes across in what is his most famous poem. To His Coy Mistress is his most famous poem, certainly his most quoted lyric, probably is also his least understood. This poem rivals perhaps it is possibly the most misappropriated poem in the English language, perhaps rivaling only Robert Frost's Two Roads Diverged in a Yellow Wood. And it's a very curious and odd poem, despite what it seems on first reading. We don't really have a composition date. It was probably begun in the early 1650s, but like essentially all of Marvell's poetry, it wasn't published until after his death in 1681. Publications in 1681. He died like 2 or 3 years before. The curiosity of it is belied by what on the surface seems to be a fairly conventional little poem. A fun one that people can seize on individual lines from without actually seeing them in context and what they might really be trying to say. And that makes it all the more interesting for us to look at. So let's take a look. To His Coy Mistress. Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges' side shouldst rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love would grow, vaster than empires and more slow, 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For, lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at a lower rate. But at my back I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour, than languish in his slow chapped power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. Wow. Interesting. This is a fairly conventional situation where the poetic speaker is trying to persuade a young woman to let him get a little something. It is a seduction song, if you will, less a seduction than perhaps a pleading. And this is all very conventional for the time. We see this throughout the Renaissance. The curiosity of it, though, is significant. It is on the surface, that is what it is. But underneath that surface, there is so much more going on that the surface only hints at very obliquely. A subtlety that, again, may have served Marvell well in his political life. Formally, we have very conventional iambic tetrameter, 4 beats per line, a regular rhyming couplet throughout, an alternation between end-stop lines and enjambments. And that first line, had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime, is such a perfect little couplet that it almost, it has that sing-songy quality that sounds almost trite. But then that next rhyme, we would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long-loved day. So that way comes in the middle. It is not end-stopped. It's in the middle of a thought. The way to walk. So, there's that irregularity all of a sudden that hints in the second couplet that things are not so even, perhaps not so obvious. Things are a little bit more complicated, a little bit more rough, perhaps, or a little bit more intricate, perhaps, than a first reading might find. The logic of it, however, is also very significant. The logic of the poem as a whole. It is constructed like an argument. That first stanza, which is 10 couplets long, has a kind of postulation. Had we enough time, if this, it is a logical proposition, let's say. If this, and the second one constructs as but, as it is an alternate side. But I always hear time coming on. If we have, in the first stanza, it is essentially, if we had, all the time in the world, if we were essentially gods, you would be something very abstract. You would be like the Ganges River, and I would be a subtle little stream, a humble stream from my little town of Hull, the Humber River from Hull, which is where Marvell was from. And he is contrasting that this sweeping personification of the lady who is so grand and so perfect, and he is just the humble swain trying to seduce her. That is an essence of eternity. A timeless realm. If we had all this time, we wouldn't have to worry. But in that second stanza, but I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. The impulse of time comes in there and says, but we don't have all that time. We have now, and we have to seize the now. Carpe diem, seize the day. We have to take advantage of the now because time is wasting. Time being an element of the worldly life, of the mundane reality of human beings in this world, not an ideal world, in this world. And then that final stanza takes on the form of a conclusion. Now, therefore, and he then launches into this argument that because, okay, we could have the ideal, but we don't because we have all of the pressures of our human world upon us, pressures. Then, of course, our conclusion is let's get busy. It is an argument. It is structured as an argument. It is a Hegelian argument, if you will, before Hegel. The thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis of a kind. It is an argument, and an argument is a logical framework. An argument is an exercise in logical argumentation. It is intellectual by its nature, not sexual. And that's the curiosity of it. He's making a logical, intellectual argument about physical pleasure, which is curious. It's a little out of place. It is a mismatch, if you will. It is in itself, then, a metaphysical conceit. The idea that you would make a intellectual and objective and formally constructed, logical, Neoplatonic argument about something as earthy and animalistic and human as sexual relations is kind of peculiar. You don't necessarily seduce someone by filing a legal brief. It is silly. The syllogism of if this then that is a formal intellectual construction, and the idea that it would be used as a seduction tool is another hint that things are going a little bit weird here. This isn't just a seduction. This isn't just a pleading. This is something a little bit more odd. The conclusion insists on seizing that present moment and making the best enjoyment of love in the short span of worldly life, and that is a very earthy argument. But the intellectualization of that, the frame that it puts it in one of mind, is inconsistent. But it is consistent with the core principles of metaphysical poetry, where the intellect is primary, where the ability to see through the surface appearances of things is so prioritized. The idea that this is just a guy trying to get a girl into bed is the surface appearance, but the poem is hinting at the ways in which we need to read into that surface appearance to see what's really going on, to see in the ordinary workings of this earth, to see the marks, the handiwork of God, of divine plan, of the organization, the infusion of divinity within the earthly realm. This is very common in metaphysical poetry and poetry of the era in general. You can see the conceit of sex being something to be read into, to see the divine plan. Let's say in John Donne's *The Flea*, but you can also see that carpe diem element in Robert Herrick's *To the Virgins to Make Much of Time*, which is a much more simplistic, I would argue, and full-throated endorsement of physical joy, of sexual pleasure, of a kind of hedonism. But this is oddly removed from that. Marvell injects so much more complication in his allusions and his metaphors. Take a look at the way that worms function in this. Then worms shall try that long preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. As physical objects, worms function as a kind of metonymy of death. Since they customarily eat the corpses. It's gross, but it's a very conventional symbol, representation of death. Worms. Shakespeare loves worm references, and you'll find them throughout. It is almost a cliche literary trope, and when you see cliches, you also have to lean in and say, well, okay, kind of like the rhyme scheme of that first couplet, it seems a little trite, it seems a little cliche, and whenever somebody is waving around a cliche in this kind of a context, you have to wonder, well, are they doing it so that the reader reacts and says, oh, well, that's just fake, that's a cliche, that's so obvious, it's artificial. But that just hints at what's going on underneath instead. It just reminds you that the surface is false. So we must pierce through the surface to find the real meaning. And the worms themselves are a kind of phallic metaphor as well. I think obviously, since they are trying the girl's virginity, the poem plainly uses that to indicate that virginity can be as well lost post-mortem. She is dead, but now the worms are going to take her virginity, which even complicates further the argument of the poem as a whole. The difference between the eternal and the mundane. This convoluted relationship between sex and death is another hallmark of the intellectualism of metaphysical poetry, especially in the way it forces readers to approach the mundane world of sensory experience through an abstract and intellectualized perspective. We're being encouraged to look at very ordinary, even coarse things from a different viewpoint, from one that is less caught up in the moment and more blasted back into an eternal perspective, a timeless perspective. The worms are also, however, obviously an expression of physical disintegration. The worms are there to eat the flesh, to decompose, literally, the flesh. The body ultimately comes to nothing in the end. According to the speaker, the woman in question should give herself over to the idealism noted in the first stanza, the idealism of that pleasure in that first stanza, where sexual activity is described in purely abstract terms. They're not getting particularly visceral or literal with it. It is an idealized sexuality, which is divorced from physicality itself. It is operating on a kind of joy that is above physicality, abstracted from physicality. It is ultimately a kind of divine presence. completely separate from the material world. So the poem on that level argues against the material world. It argues for that spirituality rather than the physical. The physical is going to rot away because worms are going to eat it. Let's just give ourselves over to the spiritual realm before that happens. These metaphors themselves can also inject some irony into the reading. Irony, another element of artifice, of poetic construction, of cliche almost even. The pressure of time is the engine of the poem, as the first line makes clear. For the poetic speaker, time is what this woman wants to separate them from their sexual fun. She is constantly delaying the action, and he is constantly pleading to hop over that delay and just dispense with it. Time is also the product of the temporal world, as we said, which here distinguishes our world from the world of divinity. And yet it is by transcending time that we can find union with God. Notably in the line, "But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near." We have the winged chariot, a pagan reference, not a Christian reference, a pagan reference to time. Time is of this world, and it is pressuring us to concerns of this world. And the hurrying near creates a kind of frenetic energy, creates a kind of pressure that we as readers even feel, a stress in the experience of time. In contrast, look at the lines, the next few lines offer deserts of vast eternity, thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Now, deserts may be pejorative, but vast eternity is a curiously peaceful image, so quickly paralleled with hurrying near. It is, very stressful, and then vast eternity. There is a certain amplitude of that, a certain ease of that can't be ignored. And while thy beauty shall no more be found, the specificity leaves space to consider which beauties might be found in place of this one woman's physical appearance. At the disappearance of the speaker's echoing song, we might not see an unpleasant turn of events for the woman either. She might be, in delaying him, she might not be all that receptive. He might know that and say, well, okay, but in heaven you wouldn't be bothered by me. On that abstract realm, you wouldn't hear any of this anymore. I would go away as a physical presence, which is so annoying to you, perhaps. From the speaker's perspective, we can also see readers pulling back. The pressure of the situation, the sales pitch that he is making, the frenetic pressure of it is somewhat less attractive at this point in the poem than the vast eternity, than the easy breezy space of the divine. And unpacking these complicated threads of thought slows down the experience of the poem all the more. We are being tossed out all of these ideas, all of these images, all of these situations, all of these contrasts that we have to wrestle through as readers. And as readers, we want to take the time to do that. We want to take the time to experience no time, to experience a removal from the pressures of time so that we can just think about all of this and make sense of it. So we are pulling back from the poetic speaker just as much as, well, the woman is already, you get the sense, leaning away from him, and now we as readers are doing the same. This is we find ourselves drawn to all of these little puzzles and all of these little mysteries and hints and whispers that are tantalizing to us in an almost sensual way, but the decoding of it will take some time. And if we are engaging in the worldly, pleasure-seeking immediacy of this poetic speaker's project, and the reading of the poem itself in that dog-trot rhythm, we can't do that. So we are separating slowly from the poem. The end of the poem makes all of these factors even more concentrated. And now, like amorous birds of prey, whoa, that's a violent image. Now, you watch a nature documentary and you can see eagles or hawks or whatever clinging to one another from high up as they plunge to the ground, and that is their mating ritual. Before they hit the ground, they separate and they have finished and they are going off. So it is a death-defying experience of sexuality, which the poem is clearly hinting at here. The immediacy of time. We have to finish before we plummet to our death. But also the animality of it. The amorous birds of prey, specifically birds of prey, I think is a violent image. The idea of snatching and pulling and ripping and all of that is endemic to birds of prey, I find is a distinctly negative view of life on Earth. The analogy, however, is, I think, very deliberate. The commingling of sex and death. And then rather at once our time devour than languish in his slow chap power. So this is another violent image, slow chap, that slow chewing, which recalls, quite frankly, the chewing of Satan in the lowest pit of hell, the chewing of the three cardinal sinners in that slow chewing that is eternal in its way. Here he is arguing for agency. This poem is saying that, rather at once our time devour. We will be the eaters. We will be the birds of prey, the chewers of this by engaging in sexuality. We will chew at time. We will eat time instead of time eating us. That destructive force, the specter of it is raised again. The speaker argues for an immediate self-immolation, which is the destruction of flesh rather than the celebration of it. So the joy of sexuality is suddenly becoming a quite violent destruction of the flesh. So again, this curious reversal where the readers are being positioned differently in relation to the poem. And then that ending is about the destruction of the flesh. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. Curious, violent again. The desperation of it, I think, is coming out. Perhaps, in the logic of the poem, the speaker, the poetic speaker, is getting more ardent, getting more pressing in his pursuit. But the cluster of metaphors there, I think, is very puzzling. The iron gates of life, the division between humanity and the divine realm. We cannot make our sun stand still. Yet we can make him run. I think the word "sun" might be a little bit of a pun there. It is the sun. You can't make the sun stand still, yet we can make him run. For one thing, humans can't really make the sun run. The idea of, well, okay, we're going to speed it up. We are going to command. Now here you are commanding the sun to do something, which is on itself, it's absurd physically, but it is a call to passion, perhaps. We will make him run. We will infuse the universe with our passion and our immediacy and speed it up in time. We will control time, but still be governed within it. So things have to go quickly as we want. But also, I think you can see the word sun as S-O-N. The idea that you are going to speed up perhaps Jesus. The idea that you are going to speed up the divine realm. Sun is always a little bit punny on these things in the Renaissance world. But the idea of having the divine world subject to your impulses, subject to your desires. It is here that we're kind of perhaps leaning back from the poetic speaker all the more, because he's gotten too carried away. He's gone too far by saying that not only the physical world of of this world and even the planets, but also the divine world. And remember, planets are going to be semi-divine in that celestial Ptolemaic system as well. But there is an effort to control things there, to dominate things there, that I think any especially Protestant and arguably Puritan reader, and here he always professed a kind of Anglicanism throughout his life. Not Puritanism, but still, he worked in the Puritan government, and he would have been sensitive to these things. The idea that human beings can have that control over God, that over the divine, is, I think, heretical, and he is here perhaps playing upon that. The effect of this, again, is intellectual delay. We have all of these images, all of these ideas, all of these very abstract and complicated concepts dumped on us right at the end. And this is supposed to be where the poetic speaker is really trying to make his move, but we're just not following, because, like, wait a minute, we got to figure out what the hell are you talking about, and we want to puzzle through all of these images, the roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball. What does that mean? That is a very famous image that gets tossed around, but the meaning is so uncertain. The idea of it is confounding. And so, instead of being a song of seduction, we end up thinking. Instead of being kind of a Ovidian seduction of sensuality, we are being pushed into a kind of a Neoplatonic realm, where we want to think about the abstraction of it, where we want to engage in our higher faculties rather than our lower faculties. And this mismatch, again, is a metaphysical conceit. The idea of the Neoplatonic and the Ovidian, if you will, or the fleshly and earthly against the heavenly, all of this is pulling at us in different directions, but I think the impulse of the poem, the undercurrent of the poem, is clear in where it wants us to go. It is not delving into the physicality, the sexuality of it. It is pushing us towards something very different, even if the surface construction of it, the situational reality of the poetic speaker, is to get this woman to sleep with him. All of this is very subtle. All of this needs to be read into, which is very much a problem of living in a dangerous time. He was living under a Cromwellian and then post-Cromwellian world, and so as he is perhaps correcting and noodling with and playing with these lines throughout the last 20 or so years of his life, Marvell has the opportunity to ruminate on this and still feel like, well, how much do I really want to say? How much can I say? I mean, somebody could find this before I die, and then I'd be really in trouble. He's not certain, so he makes it very sotto voce. He keeps it puzzling. You cannot indict him on anything that he says here, but the hints are there. And the hints are there not in a way that indicts him, but that more powerfully, I would argue, prods us to go down a similar path, to entertain similar thoughts, to puzzle out these ideas for ourselves in a way that him just telling us what he's thinking maybe doesn't, because that limits it to him. But if we take ownership of the creation of meaning, as some people call it, if we take over that process and say, well, okay, let me see, what conclusions can I draw from all of these different elements? What ideas do I bring to the table of this poem? It's so much more powerful. It's so much more lasting, because then that's our thought, not his. That is us reaching a conclusion based on our observations of the world, which include this poem, and finding in them hidden meanings, hidden subtleties of divine essence, if you will. The idea that the surface world is something illusory, is something mysterious, is something that might on the surface seem very simple, even animalistic, but that a humanist tradition impels us to seek within those moments evidence of divinity, evidence of humanity's connection to divinity, and ultimate preference for divinity.